So if you, Deanna's gonna record and we can get started. So I just want to start off by introducing our panelists today. We're gonna begin with Christian Garcia. He is an alumni of Cal Poly who has worked with Faye on several projects. Through this panel discussion, he will explain Gramsci and state response. Tania, okay, thank you. Next we have Rogelio Munoz. He is also a Cal Poly alumni and is now a first-year grad student at UCI in the anthropology department. And during this panel, he will be explaining different war responses. Then we have our very own Professor Stephanie Jones, and she teaches social stratification, crime and criminalization in society, and methods. She will be discussing Stuart Hall ideology. And last but not least, we have Professor Faye Watts. She teaches senior symposiums, social inequality in sport, quantitative methods, technology in society, and social change. And she will be breaking down moral panic. I'm gonna go through and introduce our theorists, or the panelists will be going through and introducing our theorists today, but we really want to be discussing and relating it back to the Capitol siege we had on the 6th of January earlier this year, so that after we learn a little bit about those theorists, we can go back and view the 6th with a new lens. And I know Dr. Faye, Professor Watts wanted to touch on the murder and Asian discrimination we have going on that just happened, the incident that happened the other day. So she will be touching on that too. And really quick, I'm just gonna do a little quick background for the theorists that we're going through today. I'm going to start with Antonio Gramsci. He was born in 1891 and passed away in 1937 at the age of 46. He was alive during the time of the Italian dictator's rule, Benito Mussolini, and Gramsci was famous. He was a famous intellectual who was arrested along with many other intellectuals for criticizing Mussolini's fascist society. At the time, Mussolini was rounding up and persecuting scholars who spoke out against socialism and fascism, which was the foundation of his rule, and while in prison, Gramsci continued writing about his theories and created his most famous writings, 3,000 pages of quote-unquote prison notes. And he continued to criticize socialism and the fascist ideology. And then the next theorist we have is going to be Stuart Hall. He was born in 1932 and passed away in 2014 at the age of 82. He was also a famous intellect coming out of Britain and was born in Jamaica. He was a huge critic of Thatcherism, otherwise known as Reaganism, and both are neoliberal ideologies. And both theorists were big proponents of cultural studies. So with all of that and the background introductions are over, I'm gonna pass it off to Faye so she can give a little bit, talk a little bit about what she wanted to talk about.
Yeah, before we get, before we get started, the group just wanted to make a brief statement. In the wake of yet another tragic shooting, we do feel it's necessary to highlight the ongoing ideological stigmatizations often codified of Asian Americans, and in particular Asian American immigrants and Asian American immigrant women. We want to recall that there is a long history of exploitation that's sometimes codified in law, and this is often demonizing those providing necessary work. There was the 1870 Naturalization Act that barred Chinese from gaining U.S. citizenship. The 1875 Page Act that banned Chinese women from coming to the United States, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which, it's sort of right there in the name, the 1892 Geary Act that required Chinese residents to carry papers or face deportation, the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act that prevented all immigrants from East Asian countries, the 1924 Asian Exclusion Act, which expanded the 1917 Act to include immigration from other countries in the Eastern Hemisphere, the 1942 Executive Order 9066 that authorized the internment of Japanese Americans, including those who were born here, the 1944 decision by the US Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the United States that upheld the constitutionality of the Japanese internment, the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin, and the lenient sentences that followed for the men who pled guilty to those acts. And when we put this in the context of framing, of the way we're seeing the media currently framing the shooter versus the obliteration of the victims with labels that continue their dehumanization, we have to really think about what Stuart Hall and Antonio Gramsci challenge us to think about. Stuart Hall observed, one doesn't theorize feminism, one does it. And he
I want to hug him so bad right now.
He was very open about the fact that he himself didn't really learn and understand feminism until he was confronted with differentials in labor. And so the point's not just for us to be outraged or frustrated or sad, but to do public sociology and to change the conditions at a conjunctural moment toward a more equitable, more livable, and more just world. I see Stuart Hall's fingerprints all over the way I understand and the lens that I'm using to understand these things. And there are real world consequences at play in the language we use, the way we report stories, the way we talk about people, and the way we talk about social problems and social moments, and the way we normalize particular frames. And we have an example here of just how toxic and deadly framings can be. So instead of making a statement of solidarity, I want to issue a challenge to all of us, right, to take up the mantle of Gramsci and Hall and to rail against ideological certitudes and normalizations, the things that underlie the creation of a never-ending list of dangerous others and validate existing relations of privilege and oppression. I'm going to ask all of us that whenever you accept an explanation without thinking, that at a moment you pause and question your assumptions, and when you feel that rush of anger or certitude or hurt, you stop and question the narratives that shape your beliefs and your feelings. And without that, let's learn a little more about what Hall and Gramsci have to say.
Thank you. And I just, before we get started, I want everyone, if they can, to check and make sure they're muted, just so that we have less interruptions while our panelists are talking. Thank you, guys. All right. Well, I will give the stage over to Christian.
Thank you, Maya. All right, so first, I think it's important to contextualize a little bit more the historical socio-political conditions that influenced Gramsci's theories. See, in 1913, Gramsci joined the Italian Socialist Party, which held a decent amount of political influence and popularity. When an economic crisis after World War I produced massive unemployment at a time where the price of goods continued to rise, workers turned to these groups led by the Socialist Party to lead factory occupations and strikes across the country. At one point, over 1 million people were involved in the strikes. This led to violent conflicts between pro-workers groups and right-wing groups in what became known as the Two Red Years. You see, attempting to subdue the unrest, the Italian state aligned itself with armed ultranationalist groups known as the Fascis and the Black Shirts. And while these groups had their differences, their ultimatum was the same. They wanted to deliver law and order by using violence and intimidation to destroy despicable workers that demanded livable social conditions and wages. And by 1921, Benito Mussolini, a fascist who proposed the territorial expansion of Italy and declared Italians a superior race, consolidated these right-wing groups into what became known as the Italian Fascist Party. A year later, he led the March on Rome, a 150-mile insurrection that saw 30,000 fascist supporters terrorize socialist property and sympathizers as the King of Italy called upon Mussolini to form a new government. He would rule for the next 20 years. Like Maya said, Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini in 1926, and the prosecutor at his trial stated that they needed to stop his brain from functioning for the next 20 years to stop the spread of radical ideas. See, during his imprisonment, Gramsci wrote a series of letters that became known as the prison notebooks. where he called upon his understanding of Marxism to question why socialism hadn't spread across Italy like it did in Russia. He basically outlined three main questions. First, why does the working class that vastly outnumbers the capitalist class not simply rise up in wage revolution like Marx had predicted? Second, why do the powerless consent to being ruled and exploited? And third, how does capitalism defend itself from the deficiencies that we see on a daily basis? So what did he find? Well, Gramsci's foundational argument is rooted in the concept of hegemony, the term used to express domination of one group, whether it's a nation or a class, over another, where the dominant state becomes known as the hegemon. Its origins are in ancient Greece and historically denotes bloodshed, force, and intimidation. An example would be when Russia annexed Ukraine, Russia would be identified as the hegemon. So building upon this understanding, Gramsci outlines two groups in society: civil society, the institutions and individuals that express cultural and economic demands, and political society, the state, military, and capitalist class that responds to these demands. It's this constant negotiation that dictates the tactics that political society employs to maintain its dominance over civil society. But what do these tactics entail? Well, because political society has more economic, military, and political resources, it can use what he terms coercion, the use of force to punish cultural deviation. Think the police or the military during protests. But to Gramsci, this was something that should only be used as a last resort, because why should you kill people when you can get them to willingly accept being ruled? And that's where his concept of cultural hegemony comes in. He uses this term to build upon the traditional definition and show how culture can be used to maintain dominance. Again, dominance of political society over civil society. And more importantly, he identifies the system of capitalism as the driving force that informs the hegemonic culture, ensuring the survival of the capitalist class. You see, capitalism permeates every facet of our lives, and it dictates what we justify as common sense or natural law in society. And by doing so, political society achieves consent, the use of cultural processes, the norms, values, and assumptions about the world, to get people to consent to being ruled by a system of laws, routines, and placements. Some examples of these capitalist cultural processes and paradigms can be found through things like the American dream, the idea that if you work hard enough, anything can be achieved, and the individualistic attitudes that reward nepotism, greed, and wealth accumulation. See, wealthy families and social media figures are seen as inspirational and a benchmark of American life. But for working class people, the vast majority of working class people, you have to pull yourself up by the bootstraps when things get tough, even if that means skipping sleep, meals, or time with your loved ones. And for the homeless people that you see on the street, the people that are in need, it's because they didn't try enough, or they deserve to be poor because they did something wrong. The panel that we're having right now, talking about socialism, Marx, or the headlines that you see talking about free or expanded healthcare, are seen as radical or impossible to implement. Stephanie always says that it's crazy how a lot of us can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine the end of capitalism. And so how is this consent manufactured? Well, Gramsci would say it would be through cultural sites of reproduction, the people, media, and stories that reiterate that faults, successes, and hardships are inevitable circumstances justified by capitalism. You have news reports covering homelessness, reiterating the horrors of not adhering to economic norms. Business schools and prestigious jobs that tell you that you need to go to school to make money, not to find enlightenment or peace within yourself. And you have get-rich-quick books that tell you that if your 2 or 3 jobs aren't cutting it, you can try a side hustle to make ends meet. And so as a result, everything is filtered through the lens of the market. And when people do notice social problems, political ideologies serve as a way to identify and organize around these causes. And many groups begin to form parties, not necessarily Democratic or Republican, but different ideologies competing for power or influence. Think the Tea Party or the Green Party. But at the end of the day, they serve to keep radical thought out, because solutions to capitalism's problems are going to be portrayed as only being fixed through more capitalism, donations, tax breaks, more police, and surveillance. And so what is the point? What's the goal of cultural hegemony? I would summarize it in 3 points. I would say that cultural hegemony is used to achieve the maximum amount of control or dominance by one group, political society, over a subordinate group, civil society, with the least amount of conflict. It assures that the failures of capitalism, poverty, race, and inequality are seen as necessary or given elements of a system we're born into, and that solutions to social issues that gain popular esteem in civil society are bound to the ideological boundaries of capitalism or the ideologies that stem from it. I'll end with a quote that says that the most dangerous ideas are not those that challenge the status quo. The most dangerous ideas are those that are so embedded in the status quo, so wrapped in a cloud of inevitability that we forget that they are ideas at all. That's going to be my addition to the panel. Thank you.
So thank you for that, Christian. That was a wonderful job of laying out the groundwork of Gramsci. And I'll continue the conversation, but to do so, I wanted to share my screen because I have a few slides that I think will help us contextualize Gramsci's arguments a little bit more. So first off, Christian was really describing what Gramsci calls the organic crisis, where civil society is not getting their needs met, but they're still able to make demands to political society who authorize these demands. So I want you all to picture a football game, right? And a football game consists of an offensive side, a progressive force that is making these demands, going up against a defensive force that is here to contend with these demands. So there's this clash back and forth between the two sides. And this is good. This is what's supposed to happen, according to Gramsci, in a democratic society. However, as Christian was pointing out, because a lot of the ways we run society are dependent on upkeeping capitalism, that means that there will be frequent crises and there will be frequent breakdowns of the systems we depend on, which leads to what Gramsci calls the inorganic crisis. This is when civil society is not getting their needs met and they're not even able to make demands. Again, with the football game analogy, picture the defensive force again of political society, but contending with political society on the offensive force. So here is these two aspects or these two sides of political society that are just arguing and arguing, getting nothing done for civil society. And this frustrates civil society, which Gramsci says that there's this intervention that occurs in the inorganic crisis. This is what he calls Caesarism, or the rise of a Caesar. Think of Caesar as like as a dictator or a dictatorship. This is where political society gets infiltrated by a group or person that's introducing different conformisms or different ideas of how to run political and civil society. So again, the inorganic crisis as a football game. You have these two sides, and essentially what happens here is that civil society is completely ignored. It essentially becomes the ball being pushed around by the whims of political society itself. So the Caesar comes in and argues, civil society, your needs are not being met by political society. So I implore you, give me all the power and I'll be able to address all your needs. The Caesar then will also identify the sources of civil society's problems, different types of people, and remove these people, however, in whatever way it sees fit. So think of, again, the football game. It would be as if a third football team would have run into the stadium and say, okay, we're playing now. Or you could think of it as the referees coming in and just changing up the rules completely. It could be audience members just running down the stadium. It could be a group that has nothing to do with football at all that runs in. The point being is that the game, essentially, this game is no longer football. The rules do not apply. It completely changes the game. Same with civil and political society. It completely changes the rules of the game. And another point is that Gramsci emphasizes is that the Caesar can be an individual, but it doesn't have to be. It could be multiple individuals. It could be one group. It could be multiple groups. And in this process, Gramsci talks about how responses to this inorganic crisis happens when, well, what happens in response to them is that different forms of war emerge. And think of the war or these types of wars as the football, civil society, attempting to reclaim its voice back. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because it's no longer necessary. But for the first type of war, the war position, the war position is this emphasis on recruitment. this mass accumulation of people. Think of Martin Luther King and the Poor People's March on Washington. And a more contemporary example, think of Black Lives Matter. It's this mass accumulation of people to have this big stance. So the purpose being the demands that this group has, or that this war has, cannot be ignored by civil or political society. Its power lies in numbers, its power lies in persuasion to bring as many people to this movement as possible. Second is the war of movement. This is a type of war that emphasizes clear actions to make a clear statement. Think of labor strikes, think of boycotts, think of even registering people to vote, people who've been traditionally disenfranchised or are able to vote. The act getting people registered to vote to then have a say in the democratic process. This is a war of movement, something with a clear end goal. Third is guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla warfare can look very different, but Gramsci describes it as a secret preparation of weapons. An example of this could be the Black Panthers having shootouts with police. However, in these three forms of war, Gramsci points out that against a Caesar, these forms of war don't traditionally work very well, because as soon as the Caesar catches whiff of this or is informed about these wars emerging, it would do everything in its power to stamp it out. This is why Gramsci points to a fourth type of war, the war of maneuver. This is a frontal attack, or it could also be understood as combination warfare, a combination of all three applied at different places at different times to different degrees. What differentiates the war of maneuver is that it's in it for the long run. It's a big commitment, and that is what makes it different from the other three. But finally, what's occurring in all these types of war, all these crises, political society and the state, they're watching, and they respond by reframing hegemony. What results from this is that hegemony is being adapted to new forms of morality, new forms of civilization, even readapting what it means to be human in the first place. Now, let me preface this last point by saying that the process of reframing humanity is a very violent process. Examples could be the buildup of prisons and determining who gets to be sent there for how long, the buildup of concentration camps, whereas Faye was talking about internment camps of Japanese, and determining why some certain humans are supposed to be sent there, for what reason, and what can be done to people to different types of humans once they're in these concentration camps. In essence, Gramsci is trying to warn us, or challenges us to think about the different forms a Caesar can come to be, how tend with these crises. So that concludes my portion of the analysis. So Steph will continue with by introducing Stuart Hall, who's an intellectual descendant of Gramsci. Thank you all for taking the time to listen.
Wow. So let me start by thanking both Christian and Rogelio for just phenomenal presentations of Gramsci. Those are both great. Set us all up nicely to start understanding and start complicating some of these ideas. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. So Stuart Hall really emphasizes these questions that both Christian and Rogelio both bring out when we're talking about Antonio Gramsci. Hall sort of points out these ideas around Marxism that help us to understand what gets left out. I'm going to use a big word here called reductionism. And Hall points to this Marxian idea about ideology, or the conceptualization of ideology as being reductivist, meaning that there's things that are getting left out of the way that we think about how ideology works and what the purpose or the point of how these tools that we use to sort of like call an idea real or say that an idea works for us. If we think of it in the traditional Marxian sense, what we miss is how many ways the civil society, how many ways the proletariat are also conducting their own sort of responses to ideology, responses to hegemony. And the problem is, as Hall points out, and others who have critiqued Marx, is that if we are just leaving it to ideas around labor, ideas around how labor is determined through the capitalists, ideas around how the bourgeoisie are explaining to us what ideas are important and what aren't important. First of all, that doesn't leave room for the revolution that Marx is talking about, right? That doesn't leave room for this big uniting of the proletarian class. And second of all, what that leaves out is who doesn't count, right? So if we were to think of a bunch of different types of revolution, so if we were to think of a prison riot, if we were to think of the unionizing of sex workers, if we were to think of the unionizing of immigrants, proletarian revolution, because a proletarian revolution has to include the proletariat, meaning people who are introduced to this relationship with the market, right? What Hall talks about is that if we just stick with and if we hold tight onto this Marxian analysis, what we end up with are these things called distortions. And Hall emphasizes distortions as part and parcel ideas and arguments that don't actually get us to the real point, don't actually get us to looking at how does the whole of society really work together to understand ideology. So let me give you a picture of what I mean by ideology. Think in your head of a spider web, right? Spider web has all these different crossings. If you think about each one of those crossings, that would be called an idea, right? And then all 4 crossings make up a framework, and we go on and on and on until we get this massive spider web. And so the question that Marx is trying to get at, the question that Gramsci is trying to get at, is how do we bring the spider web down? What's the string that we can use? And the thing that Hall is really pointing to is that if we only think about the conflict between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the conflict between political society and civil society, we're going to miss all of the people that don't count in terms of those definitions. And Hall is really trying to push us towards trying to have an understanding that ideology works in multiple ways. Ideology is spun through, if I'm going to continue this spiderweb analogy, it's spun through many different sections of society. And most important, the question that we have to ask is, what is holding civil society together? What is the thing that civil society becomes defined on, right? Who are the people that are conflictual even to civil society? Who are the people that don't count when we talk about civil society, right? Because if we are going to say that civil society itself is the place where the revolution has to happen, what we're saying is that the people who don't count don't belong in our revolution. And the problem is that doesn't bring the spider web down, right? We remove one string, the spider's just going to go back and respun it somewhere else. And that's how spiders work, right? That's how spider webs work. What Hall really points us to is these ideas around what we now know of as racial capitalism. So let me sort of back up a little bit. In thinking about the Marxian analysis of capitalism, what we're talking about is we have these workers. These workers are in conflict with the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are essentially trying to make sure that they keep production up, right? They keep production up, they can make more, they can sell more. The laborer comes in, they sell parts of their day to this capitalist, which is what we know of as wages. And in that wage system, in that wage relationship, the capitalist is trying to do everything they can to suppress wages, right? They don't want to pay out money to the laborer. The question that Hall and others are really trying to position us to is that the proletarian is not one group, right? Politically, ideologically, socially, the proletariat, the workers are not one group. And the workers get valued based on something else, not just how much they can work in the market, not just how much they can contribute to production, but there's something about the social ideological understanding of each body that enters our society, each body that participates and engages in that relationship that's also assessed and valued. And when we go back and we look at European capitalism, when we go back and we look at what determined the sort of ideological and social conditions of how we got here, how we get to capitalism, how we get to, as Christian said, not even be able to think beyond what a capitalist system is based on a racial ideology that allows for us as a society, allows for the capitalists, allows for political society to value each laborer based on a racial understanding, based on these racial components of our society around who in our society is allowed to have a particular kind of violence put onto them, who in our society is allowed to continue this sort of understanding that race itself is sort of like the premise of how we come to understand value. So in introducing this understanding of ideology, I want you to keep that image of the spider web in your mind and really think about what is the most destructive thing we can do to bring down the spider web, because that, for Hall, is what truly will help us sort of remove or have a conflict or even challenge hegemony. So I'm going to take it off there. Take it over to Faye Wax, who will start talking to you a little bit more about Stuart Hall.
Hi, wow, thanks everybody. That was great. And certainly again, want to highlight with the recent hate crimes, I want you to also think through the way that people are very specifically dehumanized and how certain connections are automatically made when you say Asian and massage. What was the immediate assumption that everyone made about the situation and what were the stigmatizations and demonizations? So as everybody else mentioned, you know, one thing that's really important about both Gramsci and Hall is that they're actually not trying to give us answers. They're trying to give us better ways to ask these really crucial questions, because their theories are not meant to be used everywhere all the time. What they're challenging us to do is to look at the specific conjunctural moment, the confluence of forces at your unique historical moment that are making whatever's happening where you're happening. So Hall, in particular, when he develops the concept I want to introduce you guys to next, authoritarian populism, he's looking very explicitly at what's happening in the United Kingdom with the rise of Thatcherism, even though Thatcher's not elected in 1975. He dates it at about 1975. He calls it the Great Shift Right. And he's talking very explicitly about a confluence of forces that are removing the welfare state, that are undermining certain forces and things that were given to the population, and are sort of shifting the discourse that the larger culture is having, both in the UK and here in the United States with Reaganism, that's sort of shifting these sort of basic priorities that governments are having. And but before you can really get into authoritarian populism, the way he introduces this is by applying a concept that's called moral panic, right? And the moral panic comes initially from Cohen. And the idea behind the moral panic is that there is a perceived crisis facing society or the state. And there is a group that is defined as a threat to community interests. That threat is made simple and recognizable by the media. There's a portrayal of the symbol that rouses public concern. Authorities may have a response. Policymakers have the solution. They hold out the promise of what we're going to do to fix this. And then there's some sort of change within the community. And the really important thing to understand about moral panics is they're generally there is a real crisis happening in the state, right? There's a real crisis happening, but the moral panic is not the source of the crisis, right? It's the way that the state is responding to maintain relations of power and privilege. And in the 80s, with the growth of the prison industrial complex, that's part of it. But this moral crisis, moral panic, is really what precedes this demonization of young men, and particularly young men of color, right? Or BIPOC people. And this is happening both in England and in the United States. So there's a lot of great parallels. And so Hall, with Policing the Crisis, discusses the ways that this new crime of mugging is entering the British consciousness and how it's creating all of these changes in policies and shifting in funding and shifting away of public money and public programs away from programs and into policing, with this sort of codification or this idea of the mugger, right? And what Hall is sort of is saying is that the mugger is very much a non-white other, right? That's being presented in the consciousness. And we see this pattern very much happening here in the United States as well, right? There's this threat to civil society. A great example here in the US was the Central Park Five. I was in college when this case was being debated in the media, and as we see, right, the Central Park Five were found guilty. They were real, right? We know now that they were innocent, that it was very, very much the typical sort of, or atypical crime in this case, but has nothing to do with them. But this became the centerpiece of a discussion about what was called wilding, right? And about how young men were out of control and they were a danger to the rest of us, right? And so that there's that threat made simple, made recognizable, when in reality, there's this erosion of social programs, there's an erosion of the social good. There's increasingly the expectation that individuals pay for things that are necessary to survive in our society that could have been provided by the state or were provided by the state. It's the start of the child care crisis, right? There's all these other things happening, but it's made recognizable in the bodies of young men, right? And we have so we also have the portrayal of the symbol in a way that rouses public concern, right? Well, what did we get a ton of in the 80s and 90s? Cop shows with dangerous young men who get arrested every week. And I just know that, let's see, TJ Hooker is going to keep me safe from those dangerous others, right? And see, I really went back to the 80s for that one. And we still see that now, right? In the evolution, that's the symbol. And so a lot of people have all these thoughts about the dangerous other, and they're not coming from reality. They're coming from police shows or even sort of the reality TV shows that, again, don't give us a very accurate portrayal of the majority of types of crimes that are occurring in communities. There's a response from authorities and policymakers. We have a real shift in the way we deal with crime and with the way we deal with young men and young women. We have a change in the way we do in the amount of firepower to which police have, right? We change everything about policing. And we change a lot of things about social services. And then, right? And so as Cohen and Hall point out, right, we have a very specific agenda, we have very specific images, we have a very specific context, right? Now, with policing the crisis, what then Hall introduces us to is that how that process happened. He points out in England, he develops this idea of authoritarian populism, which is very much based on Caesarism. That was introduced to you earlier in the show, that at that conjunctural moment, right, Thatcher appears as the person who's going to save England, and Reagan very much as the person who's going to save the United States. So I think you can see where this is going and how we can have a robust discussion what happens there. And I was thinking, just to close it out with authoritarian populism, right? It's very much what it sounds like. It's the person who appeals to the common person as going to meet their needs while very much maintaining the existing order of the state, right? And so in Rogelio's example of the football team, it's like there's a bunch of teams out there competing to win this trophy, but some of them are NFL teams and have all these resources to influence the culture, who are going to get watched by everyone, whose message is going to be seen and heard. And then there's some college teams who maybe can get their voice out to a part of the public. And then there's high school teams that most of us aren't going to have heard of. And we're all out there sort of duking it out in these games. And there's a couple of owners who are reaping all the benefits, and all the rest of us are still getting CTE, no matter where we are in that cultural hierarchy. Right. And so I would want to sort of challenge us, but what I think I do with Hall that is the most important is not just challenge other people's thinking about culture, but to challenge my own. Because when it came to the crisis at the Capitol, it was very easy to say, racists, they have no legitimate concerns, they're just a bunch of crazy racists. And you know what? That's still racism doing the ideological work of protecting the state. Because even though they're not expressing it in ways that are in any way palatable. How is that exactly what's supposed to happen? How is that not a continuation of driving apart class interests? So we're having this very effete discussion ultimately about race and racial identity that still is sort of failing to capture what's happening for working people of any ethnicity. And they don't have the language to jump into our discussion. Why would they? This is our discussion. This is our language, right? These are our tools. How are we sort of continuing a discussion that is still keeping us apart? And how are we failing, right? I can't do anything about, like, because they're not asking us to change individuals. Like, we accept that there's individuals out there that none of us want to have lunch or dinner with. But how do I change the structure so that there's fewer of those individuals, or that we're all getting our needs met so we're not in open conflict? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Watson. To the rest of our panelists, at this time, I'm going to open up the invite you guys to ask questions on the chat. We're probably not going to get to everybody's questions, but while you guys think about that, I'll start it off. I want to ask Professor Jones, did anyone else on the panel, do you want to point something out that you thought was really important that one of the other panelists said, or something that you want to touch on, and especially in regards to the 6th and the events that have just been happening in the beginning of this year?
Yeah, thank you, Maya. I think I just want to circle back on this idea around moral panics, because I think when we hear moral panics, I think we think that's just something that happens over there, right? That's just something that these people who buy into this media, or people who buy into these crazy scams on Facebook, that's something that doesn't happen to me. It's not something that I am susceptible to. But the truth is that with the way that we obtain information, with the way that we come to understand new events, we all have this sort of propensity to cycle through, again, the spider web that we're familiar with, the spider web of knowledge that we're familiar with. And I think we do a lot in our department to sort of point out to everyone that spider web is a dangerous trap, right? There's not a lot to hold on to. And when we're talking about the events on the 6th, right? You're watching a moral panic happening right before your eyes. But as Faye has already pointed out, most people aren't allowed to use that language, right? Most people aren't familiar with that language. And when we think through sort of what the ask was, right? What the ask was of the people on the 6th, we can really, I think, use the language of a serious internal coup, right? You have people who have been in power seriously trying to make sure that they can stay in power, and doing what they can to challenge those who are coming in and articulating that, these folks don't deserve to have power anymore. And if we just leave it to that sort of simplistic, folks who have power are feeling threatened about whether or not we think that threat is a true challenge to their authority, but they have power. Someone's coming in and maybe taking it away, or reshaping it, or re-articulating how we should understand that power, and they feel panicked. They feel like something has to happen. And what I often say is not, why did the 6th happen? Because I think that might be looking at the 6th as an isolated event, but instead looking towards, why is it that these groups of people were allowed to participate in these activities, right? Why is it that Black Lives Matter organizers wouldn't storm the Capitol? Why is it that, folks who are arguing against concentration camps and the works around those, why aren't they storming the Capitol? What is it about this group that they feel so threatened and so much anxiety around their own threat to in their eyes, their nation, their sort of control? What is it about that allowed for military, police, state elected officials, the FBI, to all hold their hands back and go, well, I mean, this is kind of part of the process. And that wouldn't happen for any other group.
Thank you. There's a specific question here for Christian. It says, it's by Anthony. It says, Christian, would you say that capitalism uses social media as a tool that allows them to keep the working force in capitalists under control and not demanding too much of an equal pay that will ultimately cut into the profits of the capitalist?
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question. And it actually ties in really well with the project that you were talking about earlier that I'm running with Faye. This is actually exactly what we're looking at. So I'll preface my answer with this, or by talking about that. The project that we're doing is basically looking at, when you go onto things like Twitter, when you go onto Instagram, any type of social media, a lot of the times different brands will have some sense of social media presence. Nike will have, their social media team. Different smaller brands will have their social media teams. And all of these different corporations are kind of vying for attention. They're trying to vie for loyalty from civil society. And what we've seen, recently, and especially kind of going off of this idea of moral panics and going off of this idea of, targeting things that are happening in civil society, we've seen something to where a lot of these brands are kind of, taking up these mantras of Black Lives Matter, taking up these ideas of, oh yes, workers' rights matter, and kind of funneling that into their marketing schemes. And by doing that, for the consumer, it gives you this feel-good type of, oh, I bought Nike and they support Black Lives Matter, so I am doing my part as an activist. I am doing my part as somebody who is, feeding the flames of the revolution. But if you take it back a step and kind of, take in what we've been talking about this entire time in terms of capital, wealth accumulation, and the people who these types of conversations actually benefit, it turns into something to where, yes, you're right. We use things like social media to organize and to kind of show people who we are. But in doing so, we are also aligning ourselves with brands like Nike, who have a history of not paying their workers, of exploiting their workers in other countries, and contributing to a lot of the problems that affect people of color, that affect the exact people that we're trying to liberate and trying to give better conditions to as a whole. So there's a lot that I can really go into, but I think that looking at social media specifically, it is something that we need to be aware of in terms of who exactly are we aligning ourselves with, and how are we kind of humanizing these corporations that aren't human? How are we humanizing the practices that actually we should have autonomy in dictating what we want to say as being, right, or as being, the conditions that we want? And I think that's probably where I would go with that question.
Thank you. Yeah. We also have another question for Professor Jones from Arij. Professor Jones, why do you think that BLM would not storm the Capitol? Is it because they knew what the outcome would have been, or is it possibly because the other group knew that the outcome would result differently for them?
So I kind of want to redirect that question into not assuming what people know, right? I want to assume that the folks at the Capitol, they definitely were militarized in ways that they expected a lot of confrontation. And I want to assume that Black Lives Matter are watching this happen and also have developed their own critique. And I don't want to assume that I know what that critique is in any, developed way. But I think instead what we can ask is, what are our responses to the events of the 6th? What's our immediate reaction? So if you watched the events of the 6th and you said, oh, well, screw those guys, they're carrying Confederate flags and who cares what they think, right? Or if you said, oh man, these people are standing up for my rights, and in these ways, because they're standing up for my rights, I defend what they're doing. The question that I think Hall and Gramsci would really want us to connect with is, where is that coming from? Where is that immediate reaction coming from? And how then are we saying or suggesting that, again, certain types of violence are more acceptable for certain people than others? How then are we supporting the state in trying to sort of like respond to or react in a way that, you know, we can allow certain groups of people to attack the Capitol with limited repercussions in the action, right? How is it that we can allow Black Lives Matter protesters to be shot at by police officers with rubber bullets, and we don't have that same kind of visceral reaction, right? And so the question isn't who knew what and when they knew it, but instead, what are we as the populace? How are we responding to these events? And how does our silence, how does our action, how does our support, how does our conflictual ideas, how does that actually support what the state is trying to do, which is to maintain power and control? I hope that answers the question well enough.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump on and add to what Steph was saying too. If you think about the way the media covers Black Lives Matters versus the reality of what Black Lives Matters is it's very, I mean, it's that exact problem, right, that Stuart Hall is getting at, is Black Lives Matters tends to be covered interchangeably with the actions of random people at protests, right? So they'll say those looters from Black Lives Matters, or like Black Lives Matters is a very explicit statement against nonviolence. They have very explicit platforms. To frame Black Lives Matters as an incredibly effective organization that is doing unbelievably important work, which, you know, as someone who studies social movements or teaches social movements, they are incredibly impressive. Like, setting aside my own personal politics and the fact that I am in agreement with them, setting that aside, they are incredibly impressive as an organization in what they've accomplished, in the way they strategize, in their asks, in their understanding of the different levels of government. And you never really see them discussed publicly in that way. There's no recognition of what an incredibly successful and like that incredible success of what they've built. You don't ever see that framing. They're framed in exactly the same way the mob at the Capitol was. And though they had firepower, they burned all of their political capital in one afternoon with no legitimate acts, right? They got into the Capitol, and other than wreaking havoc, they actually had no legitimate political demands, right? That is an incredible failure. That is beyond a failure of a movement, right? When you contrast that to Black Lives Matters, which had, you know, Gaston coming into Los Angeles, immediately making changes that were on the Black Lives Matters agenda, because he knew exactly what would happen if he didn't, that there'd be protesters in front of his house every Wednesday at the exact same time, right? So we have this example of these amazing successes that aren't covered at all against what is actually an incredible failure that's not really conceptualized in that way. Like, they had no articulated demands. What a failure. And but also, who does that serve, right? Who does it serve that to delegitimize, right, what they might, in theory, like, you know, like there might be some generic, there might be some way, like, well, who does it serve to keep the working class apart, to keep part of the working America mired in racism, right? Who does that serve? Right? Because they didn't have a legitimate ask.
I wanted to weigh in real quick. I saw two questions directed towards me, and I kind of wanted to see if I could answer both at the same time. So I believe this one, Salcedo was asking, can a Caesar be a group or an individual? I said my answer to that is yes, it can be both. Caesarism can even be an idea in of itself. Now, there's another question that I think bridges this point very well. So I believe it's Isabel Felix Gonzalez is asking, how do I see like Caesarism today in like the US? So I'm going to use I'm thinking of Caesarism being implemented as an ideal at this very moment, like as we speak. So Faye was talking about like the response and how it was a very unsuccessful, or like not the response, the actual events was this very incohesive, unsuccessful, did not yield anything. But the state's response to that, like as of right now, like there are different like bills popping up all over different states that are literally like redefining what it means to be a so-called terrorist. How do these like labels get applied? And like what types of new controls can be formed out of this like redefinition of what it means to be a terrorist or a domestic terrorist. So I would say like this is like a perfect example of a Caesar rising. These are these Caesarist ideas of implementing even more control, even more governmental controls, like, and applying these like how should I describe this? So when in response to the actual storming of the Capitol, the actual like what these people were saying, what like QAnon and these weird different groups and who knows what they were arguing doesn't really matter to the state. What matters to the state is how do we respond to this? How do we redefine people who storm the Capitol, period? And how these terms are going to be applied, these so-called domestic terrorists, how this is going to be applied will, it evidently, I think, yield like it'll create different for like different social movements or different types of people. It'll be attached to people who are already in very in low positions of power, no power. So that I hope that kind of answers your question. So it's like Caesarism as this idea implemented to redefine the terrorist or the domestic terrorist in this case, and then applying it to create even more state controls. So that's my response to both of those questions. I hope that helps.
Yeah. And to add on to that too, kind of like what Raheli was saying in terms of like Caesarism being an idea, I think one thing that I want to say is that sometimes it's easy to, Gramsci's already, or is kind of trying to, like Raheli said, warn us. He's not necessarily trying to say like this will happen, but he's trying to warn us so that we can see these things coming before they happen. And I think that's something that happens a lot for us is that when we have, these super radical, big events happen, we kind of look at it as like, oh yes, look at all those crazy people. Kind of like we said earlier, look at all those races. We don't really give them legitimacy. And that's kind of actually exactly how these types of Caesaristic ideas begin. I think that one thing we were talking about before is that, fascism in America isn't concentrated in just this, group of like people that don't understand, politics, that don't understand the mechanisms of American life. A lot of the people on the six, you had, working class individuals from all walks of life, but at the same time, you had, you had people in politics. You had Josh Hawley and Madison Cawthorn that were actively sympathizing with these individuals and telling them that they are being listened to. And I think that when you have that idea in conjunction with everything that we've talked about in terms of stereotypes, in terms of who is being policed and how those people are being policed, that is where, we start to get to this problem of like, okay, so now the state is responding and it's maintaining its power, it's maintaining its dominance from these working class people that attempted to revolt against the government. But in doing so, they're also not only reinforcing, but reinventing and, further subordinating a specific group of people through those laws by saying that, you can run people over in the streets. We have people like Senator Ron Johnson, who was talking about the Capitol siege the other day and said that he knew those people at the Capitol love this country. They truly respect law enforcement and that they would never do anything to break the law, so he wouldn't be concerned. But you have people who are marching peacefully in the streets and you have a couple outside their home pointing guns out. And those people are seen as, oh, they're just protecting their property. They're just protecting themselves. And so I think that when we talk about Caesarism, it's important to not only see it as, or to look at these events as not some kind of radical, isolated event that we need to forget, but a reminder that when these things happen, not only do they serve to proliferate the ideas that already exist, but in conjunction with the people that are already in government, in conjunction with the stereotypes and the mythologies that already exist, serve to, like they said earlier, further divide us and further stratify and reinforce those norms that we've been talking about during the course of this panel, and prevent, again, any threats to the survival of the capitalist class, prevent any threats to the undoing, basically, of the spider web that we've been talking about. So,
Thank you, Christian. And we're gonna do one more question because I know some people have class at 1, so if you have to leave, that's fine. We're gonna do one more question and then close out, but this last one is for Dr. Faye Watts. In terms of moral panic, do you think making this term normal and integrating the concept into society would lessen the overall panic? If not, what are some other ways that we can take action to lessen the overall panic response? Do you think having moral panic can be somewhat of a positive thing?
So, those are all great questions, and I'd love to hear everybody else jump in too afterwards. So moral panics are never the way to go because it's always sort of that knee-jerk response. It's always oversimplifying a very complicated situation, right? Anytime you have a major social crisis, there's multiple factors at play, and you really need to be addressing them on multiple levels and in different ways. Definitely making people aware on the media, like definitely factual information and good factual contextualized information is one critical way to sort of undermine the power that moral panic discourse has, right? Like when I was in college and the Central Park Five was happening, we were reading books about stigmatizations and criminalizations, and none of us thought that they were guilty or should go to jail, and all of us were very, like, and it wasn't just, or at least a lot of us sort of said, there's not enough evidence to judge here. This shouldn't be playing out this way. So absolutely educating people is one crucial way to do it. And Stuart Hall very explicitly is one of the people who got BBC4 on the air, right? So Stuart, it's like sort of like in terms of, if you look at the big picture of what we need to be doing to take down the spider web, it seems overwhelming and it seems insurmountable. And Stuart Hall would agree with you. So what did he do in his actual life when he wanted to take action? He fought to get a 4th channel added to BBC public channels that was devoted exclusively to presenting alternate viewpoints, in particular more media created by, not just about, but created by non-white people in Britain and immigrants and the working class. And he left the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies to teach at the public university at the height of his career. And what he basically said is, if I stay at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, it becomes the Stuart Hall Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies, and it doesn't grow and it doesn't change. And I'd rather go teach people who wouldn't have access to Stuart Hall otherwise, right? And so, like, I just sort of like, right? I mean, like, wow, like what a guy, like seriously, like, wow, what a model for how you do public sociology. And so, like, I think that really is the answer, is that we have to really be impressed by and reward and valorize that kind of social action. And again, like even when with Black Lives Matters, again, it's doing those small things. Like, we're going to demand criminal justice in this particular way in this one city, and that can be a model for other communities.
Well, thank you. And I know people have class at 1, so I just want to say thank you guys all for coming, and thank you to the panelists for all your hard work and all the hours we put into this. It really paid off, and it was really fun to see it all come together. So I just wanted to thank you guys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you both, professors. Thank you, Miss. Thank you, Miss.
I swear I'm not ignoring you. I was just
No, I'm just feeding.
You're faded.
Thank you.
Thank